There are some sermons that I prepare to preach that particularly I wish everybody was here for, and this is one of those, but not everybody's here. It's rare that everybody's here anyway, but when I think about the perfect church, and I think about, people, perfect church, there is no perfect church, right? Because all churches have people. But when we think about the perfect church, I think to some degree, what we mean by that is, of course, God planned the church in perfection. He planned for it to be the way he wanted it to be. But also the word perfect many times in the New Testament, the Greek word that's used for it, there is one that speaks of sinless perfection. It talks about Christ being sinlessly perfect. But there is another word that's used that's often translated perfect or perfection that just talks about being mature and complete. And so I want us to think about that because obviously we know none of us is perfect and we're all in the church, and so the church isn't going to be perfect because we're in it. But God's design for it was perfect. But what we want is to make the church mature and complete so that it's well-rounded, that it's not lopsided, that it's not, we think about sometimes we compare the church to a ship or boat of some kind. You don't want a ship that's leaning to one side, tip over and capsize. So you don't want the church to be like that. You want the church to be settled and moving in the right direction. And we're going to look at some of those things this morning. We're going to look at one church in particular from the scriptures that we don't have a lot of information about, but what information we do have about it shows a church that had grown to maturity. And it was, in some ways, a perfect church. Now, they still had their troubles, and we'll see some of those even. But even in their troubles, they were encouraged to work through those, to build each other up, to grow closer to what God wanted them to be. We're always going to have troubles. We're always going to have problems to work through. But we want to strive for that perfection, that maturity, that completeness. Now, before we go too much further into this, I want to understand, I love the church here at Pisgah, and I think it's a good church. I think it's a better church than a lot of other churches out there. But good enough isn't always good enough. Let's strive to grow and be even better. Let's strive for that perfection that God wants from us, that completeness, that maturity, to be all that he wants us to be, to not let him down in any way. So as we think about this, and we introduce this idea, I want us to think about one church in particular, and that is the church in Philippi. Let's look first of all here as we consider this church at how that church began. The beginning of the church in Philippi is recorded for us in Acts 15:40 through 16:40. It's about a chapter's worth there. And in that section, we're certainly not going to read all of that whole section, but as we consider what happens there, the way that church got its start, it first started with Paul having a vision. In the night, he had a vision of a man of Macedonia standing there urging him and saying, "Come over to Macedonia and help us." This is in Acts chapter 16 and verse 9. And Paul, seeing the vision, immediately we sought to go into Macedonia, concluding that God had called us to preach the gospel to them. Notice when he had this vision, "Come help us in Macedonia," his first thought wasn't, they probably need a hospital there. Hospitals are great, but that wasn't Paul's first thought. He didn't think, what they really need is some industry and some job opportunities there in Philippi. When he saw this vision, we need help over here, he knew immediately what they need is the gospel. They need the gospel. And so he works to take the gospel to them. So they left Troas, and they went through Samothrace, and the following day to Neapolis, and from there they went to Philippi, which is the leading city of a district of Macedonia, and a Roman colony. And that's where they stayed and started working. And where they started preaching and teaching. He went out and found a place of prayer, found a couple of women out there, or a few women, and one of them, named Lydia, is the first convert. In verse 15, she was baptized in her household. She urges them to stay with her. Let her be hospitable to them while they continue preaching and teaching. They keep doing that. But problems arise. We see in the following verses that as they're preaching and teaching, they run into some trouble with a girl that was demon-possessed and the people who owned her as a slave, because Paul cast the demon out. And they got angry about that. And so they're in jail. They're arrested, they're beaten, they're put in jail. In the middle of the night, there's an earthquake and the doors are all open. And verse 27 of chapter 16 says, when the jailer woke and saw the prison doors were open, he drew his sword and was about to kill himself. He thought the prisoners had escaped. And he was going to die anyway. He might as well do it himself. You don't let prisoners escape if you're a Roman jailer. Paul cried out, don't hurt yourself, we're all here. So the jailer came in and he falls down in front of him and he says, what must I do to be saved? Paul then teaches him. And by the end of that night, he and his family are baptized as well. And this is the beginning of the church in Philippi. Lydia and her family, the Philippian jailer and his family. Sometimes we feel discouraged. We just have a small church. 2 families in Philippi. 2 families. That was it. That was how it started. That's where it begins. So then, of course, the people come and want Paul out of their city. They want to get rid of him. They find out, though, that he was a Roman citizen, and they beat him without a trial. And so he tells them, hey, you beat me. I was a Roman citizen, and I didn't even have a trial. And then they're like, oh, please, okay, just leave our city. Go away. But he stays a little while longer. And when they had seen the brothers, they encouraged them and departed, verse 40 of chapter 16 tells us. So that's the start of it. And they left. They were there for a fairly short period of time. 2 families are converted. We don't know how many people are in those 2 families. There might have been another conversion in that process somewhere that we don't know about. But these 2 are the only 2 we know about. But they stayed there for a few days, a couple weeks, a month maybe. Got things started, and then they left. Now, Lydia was a Jewish woman who had a history of knowing about God to some degree. We don't know how much she knew. But the Philippian jailer was a heathen Roman soldier. He knows nothing about being a Christian except what Paul's able to teach him in these few days. So this church, brand new, immature, and they're left to fend for themselves for this time being. Okay? But then we want to talk about the building up of the church, because Paul didn't just abandon them. He builds them up in a couple of different ways. He travels back around through the cities. In Acts 20 and verses 3 through 6, it says, there he spent 3 months, and when a plot was made against him by the Jews, as he was about to sail for Syria, he decided to return through Macedonia. So he's leaving the place he was. He's going back to Macedonia. That's where Philippi was. And mentions some people that accompany him. Some went on ahead, and they were waiting at Troas. But we sailed away from Philippi after the days of unleavened bread. And then in 5 days they came to Troas. So they stayed in Philippi for a little while again and helped to build the church up. One of the things that they were doing on this second journey through, after they had established these churches the first time around, when they came back through, it talks about the fact that they were appointing elders in these churches. And so here that we have the second time that he comes through Philippi. And then he builds the church up more by sending them the letter that we know in our Bibles as Philippians. And we're going to draw some things then from that chapter, or from those chapters of the book of Philippians. Now, Philippians is a short book. It's only 4 chapters long. But there's still some rich detail there. But the church began, then it was built up some more. A letter was written to them to build them up further. And then we want to look at the church at Philippi. Why do we pick this church to describe what the perfect church is supposed to be? Because Paul describes in this letter to them the things they were doing and the things they needed to be doing to be a mature, wonderful, complete, perfect church like God wanted them to be. So we start with the fact that the church at Philippi was pressing on. They were progressing. They didn't just stay in their same level of knowledge, their same way of doing things. They grew. They progressed. They pressed on. They moved toward their goals. In Philippians chapter 1, verses 9 through 11, Paul says, and it is my prayer that your love may abound more and more with knowledge and all discernment. So he wants their love to abound, he wants their knowledge to abound, he wants their discernment to abound, so that you may approve what is excellent, and so be pure and blameless for the day of Christ. When we stand before Christ on Judgment Day, don't we want to be pure and blameless? He wanted that for the church in Philippi as well. Filled with the fruit of righteousness that comes through Jesus Christ to the glory and praise of God. So he wants them to be filled with fruit. He wants, a tree that, we've got a fig tree. It has grown in our yard for 8 years now. I hadn't got a fig off of it yet. Not a very good fig tree. I may have to move it or something. It's in a bad spot, I'm afraid. Because when we had it in Mississippi, it was actually making figs. So, I don't know, maybe I need to move it to the south side of the house instead of the north side. Whatever. We have to do something different. Put it in a sunny spot instead of a shady spot or something. But I want it to make fruit, and it hasn't been doing it. And it did it before, so I know it can. The church at Philippi, Paul wants them to be filled with fruit. You want something that's supposed to produce fruit. You want it to produce that fruit. Down in verses 25 and 26 of chapter 1, he says, I'm convinced of this. I know that I will remain and continue with you all for your progress and your joy in the faith, so that in me you may have ample cause to glory in Jesus Christ because of my coming to you again. He's talking about wanting to come see them again. Maybe he did. Maybe he made that trip. Maybe he got to see them again. We don't know for sure. But he says, I want to see your progress. I want to see your joy. There is a joy that comes from being a Christian, but there is another joy that comes from growing as a Christian, learning more, loving more, progressing in the faith, becoming stronger, having a deeper relationship with God and with Christ. And all of those things are important things. So the church at Philippi was pressing on. And that is one of the things that made it a perfect church. The church at Philippi was edifying one another. Now they needed a little edifying to edify one another here. In Philippians 4 and verses 1 through 3, Paul says, "Therefore, my brothers, whom I love and long for, my joy and crown, stand firm thus in the Lord, my beloved. I entreat Euodia and I entreat Syntyche to agree in the Lord." So there were some times of difficulty. These two women were not in agreement. There was some strife there. We don't know the details of what their problem with each other was, but it was a big enough deal that Paul thought it was important to mention it in this letter to the church, that these two need to get along. They need to agree in the Lord. And then he says, "Yes, I ask you also, true companion or true yoke fellow." Some think this should have actually been a proper name as well, that it should have been Syzygus, because that's the Greek word, and that it's actually another person that specifically that he is asking. "I ask you also, true companion, help these women who have labored side by side with me in the gospel together with Clement and the rest of my fellow workers whose names are in the book of life." So notice that these two women had labored with Paul. We didn't know who they were. We hadn't heard about them. But they had worked with Paul, and now they're having a disagreement, and Paul wants them to get along. But notice he says that their names are in the book of life. He doesn't want this disagreement that they're having to do anything that might jeopardize their eternal life. He wants them to overcome these difficulties that they're having with each other. Get over that and move on and keep helping the church. And he wants this other true companion that he mentions to help them get over that. Sometimes when we're at odds with somebody, we can't see it clearly. And we need somebody else to step in and say, "Hey, think about it this way. You're missing this." And get these two people back together to work together. But they were to be edifying one another. This true yoke fellow needed to be edifying these two women, building them up, encouraging them to do what was right and get along with each other. But notice the things that he says about, he talks about them, how they helped him, they labored with him, their names are in the book of life, all of these wonderful things. He says about the church, "I love and long for you. You're my joy and my crown. Stand firm." Those are some things that build a church up, aren't they? There are some preachers who love to beat a church down and talk about how bad they are and how much they need. "Oh, you're terrible and you're horrible and you're sinners." And I don't like to be one of those kind of preachers. I want to be like Paul is here. "You're my joy and my crown. I love you. I long for you. I can't wait till Sunday comes so I can see you again." Those kinds of ideas instead of beating somebody down and browbeating them with your words. Encouraging and edifying one another. That's what makes a church good, a perfect church. When they're edifying each other and not tearing each other down. He talks to another group of churches in Galatia about those who are biting and devouring one another and are in danger of being consumed of one another. That's not nearly as positive a thing, is it? We don't want to be biting and devouring each other. We want to be building each other up, standing firm in the Lord together. That's the wonderful thing. So we need to be edifying one another. And then we see that the church at Philippi was rallying behind missions. We talked about this some during our class time hour this morning about the importance of missions and our need and desire to want to support mission work. And this is something the Philippian church was doing. Philippian church, remember, they started out very small. They weren't rich. In fact, when Paul talks to the Corinthians about the churches in Macedonia, Philippi being one of those, he talks about how out of their poverty they gave. They weren't rich people. They were poor, but they still wanted to support the work, and so they did. Philippians chapter 4, verses 14 through 18. It was kind of you to share my trouble. And you Philippians yourselves know that in the beginning of the gospel, when I left Macedonia, no church entered into a partnership with me in giving and receiving except you only. Even in Thessalonica, you sent me help for my needs once and again. Not that I seek the gift, but I seek the fruit that increases to your credit. I have received full payment and more. I am well supplied, having received from Epaphroditus the gifts you sent, a fragrant offering, a sacrifice acceptable and pleasing to God. So think about that. What a wonderful thing. They helped Paul on at least 2 times when he was in Thessalonica, but now even more. He's received a full payment and more from them this time. Epaphroditus brought gifts as well. They're supporting the spread of the gospel. Sometimes we get frustrated because sometimes the people that live around us don't seem to be interested in hearing the gospel. They don't care about wanting to be a Christian. But there are places in the world where the gospel is spreading, where it is growing. And so we can feel the joy and the happiness that comes from sharing the gospel by helping and encouraging missionaries and supporting them, rallying behind missions like the church in Philippi was. And they were doing that. They were sending support to help spread the gospel. And that helps ease any frustrations. Yes, we still try to talk to people. We still try to reach out to people here in our neck of the woods as well. But we gotta get the gospel to other people too, those who will listen. And then we see that the church at Philippi was faithful consistently. And you could also probably say they were faithfully consistent, but they were faithful consistently in this case. Philippians chapter 1 and verse 27, he says, "Only let your manner of life be worthy of the gospel of Christ, so that whether I come and see you or am absent, I may hear of you that you are standing firm in one spirit, with one mind, striving side by side for the faith of the gospel." Isn't that what you want people to hear? If somebody hears about the church at Pisgah and they live in Texas or Canada or Russia, don't you want them to hear that here is a congregation that is standing firm with one mind, striving side by side for the faith of the gospel? That's a wonderful thing for a congregation. To hear that they're standing for the gospel, that they're working together. We don't have to be the biggest congregation in the world to do that. You see, many of these, it doesn't matter how big you are. You can press on, you can edify, you can rally behind missions, you can be faithful and do so consistently. Philippians 2 and verses 12 through 13. "Therefore, my beloved, as you have always obeyed, so now, not only as in my presence, but much more in my absence, work out your own salvation with fear and trembling, for it is God who works in you, both to will and to work for his good pleasure." God's working in you. Be faithful to him, as you have always obeyed. Now, there weren't a lot of the churches that the apostles wrote to in the New Testament that got that kind of a compliment. Many of the congregations that Paul writes to, it's you're not obeying and you need to straighten up and fly right. And many of the churches that John writes to in Revelation, the book of James, the books of 1st and 2nd Peter, and 1st, 2nd, and 3rd John, a lot of these are written to people because there's a problem they need to fix. But he says to this church, as you have always obeyed. not only in my presence. So they didn't just obey when Paul was there watching them, but even when he was absent, he said, but much more in my absence. They kept doing what was right even when Paul wasn't there to watch them. And that's important. That makes them pretty special among many of the churches in the first century church, and one of the things that makes them a perfect church in a sense. All right, we got to move faster. They were evangelistic. Philippians 1, 3 through 6. Paul says, I thank my God in all my remembrance of you, always in every prayer of mine, for you all, making my prayer with joy because of your partnership in the gospel from the first day until now. So there was a partnership in the gospel. They were helping spread the gospel. They were evangelistic. They wanted people to come to Christ. And he said, I am sure of this, that he who began a good work in you will bring it to completion at the day of Jesus Christ. God has begun a good work in all of us. And he's striving to bring it to completion. And we need to work with him to bring that to completion. But to work together to spread the gospel. But then the church at Philippi was committed to working. They weren't lazy. They were committed to working. He says in verses 6 again, and I am sure of this, that he who began a good work in you will bring it to completion. Keep working. The church, we talked about it being like a ship earlier. It's not a cruise ship. It's a battleship, and everybody has their post. We're not just out there to enjoy as God brings us to heaven. We're out there to work. It's a working ship. And he says then in verse 7, it is right for me to feel this way about you all because I hold you in my heart, for you are all partakers with me of grace, both in my imprisonment and in the defense and confirmation of the gospel. That's a work. Defending and confirming the gospel. That's a work that we must do. Philippians 2:13. For it is God who works in you, both to will and to work for his good pleasure. So even though we're working, it's God working in us. We can't do it on our own. We can't be the perfect church by ourselves. It's God working in us that's going to make us mature and complete. And then in chapter 2, verses 25 through 30, he says, I thought it necessary to send to you Epaphroditus, my brother and fellow worker and fellow soldier, and your messenger and minister to my need. For he has been longing for you all and has been distressed because you heard that he was ill. So Epaphroditus was from Philippi. They had sent him, remember, with the gift that we talked about earlier. And then he got sick, and they heard he was sick while he was with Paul, and they were concerned about that. And he was upset because they were concerned because he'd been sick. Look at the love there. They were concerned about him. He was concerned about them being concerned about him. He didn't want them to be distressed over that. Paul says, indeed, he was ill, near to death. So this was a serious illness. But God had mercy on him and on me also, lest I should have sorrow upon sorrow. I am more eager to send him, therefore, that you may rejoice at seeing him again, and that I may be less anxious. So receive him in the Lord with all joy, and honor such men, for he nearly died for the work of Christ. Not many of... Now, he didn't nearly die because of persecution like some in that day were, but he nearly worked himself to death for Christ. Don't know, did he catch pneumonia or, who knows what happened to him, but he got very sick because he was working for the Lord. He risked his life to complete what was lacking in your service to me. And so he was a hard worker, and he was one of the Philippians, but a good example of the membership of that congregation. Willing to work for the Lord. But then we see also that the church in Philippi was trained to maturity. Philippians 3, verses 15 through 16. Paul says, let those of us who are mature think this way. He's talking about He talked about in the passages just before that, the verses just before that, about having the mind of Christ, the kind of humility that Christ had, who even though he was equal with God, he still came down to earth and served. And he wants us to have, if we're mature, we need to think the same way. And he's telling the church at Philippi. He says, if anyone thinks if in anything, if I can get these words together, if in anything you think otherwise, God will reveal that also to you. Only let us hold true to what we have attained. One of the things about maturity is once you reach maturity, you need to stay there. We don't backslide back down into immaturity. Stay at that mature level. And sometimes it takes work to hold true to what we've attained. It's hard. We forget things and we get sidetracked by things, but we need to stay focused on being trained to maturity. Then we see that the church at Philippi was incredibly benevolent. They gave. I mentioned it briefly earlier in 2 Corinthians chapter 8, verses 1 through 5. Paul's writing to the Corinthians, encouraging them to give. Because we want you to know, brothers, about the grace of God that has been given among the churches of Macedonia. And Philippi is one of those churches. For in a severe test of affliction, their abundance of joy and their extreme poverty. They weren't just lower middle class, okay? They were extreme poverty. Have overflowed in a wealth of generosity on their part. For they gave according to their means, as I can testify, and beyond their means of their own accord. So he said, I didn't make them give it. They gave it willingly of their own accord, beyond their means. They sacrificed to give, even though they themselves were in poverty. That's amazing. Begging us earnestly for the favor of taking part in the relief of the saints. Now, this money was going back to the churches in Judea were struggling because of a famine. And so Paul was going around to the churches collecting money to take back to Judea to help the people who were having part in this famine. And when he got to Philippi, he's like, well, these poor folks already, they can't. But he says they begged us for the favor of taking part. Jesus said it's more blessed to give than to receive. Even some that are poor, they want to give. Reminded of the widow with her 2 mites that she dropped in the collection. And Jesus said she gave more than all those people that were dropping in bags full of money. Even out of poverty. And they begged to be able to do it. They were incredibly benevolent. He said, this was not as we expected, but they gave themselves first to the Lord. If we give ourselves to the Lord first, then the rest is going to follow, isn't it? Because not anything that we have is ours. It's His to do what needs to be done with. Then we see that the church at Philippi was organized fully. In Philippians 1 and verse 1, Paul and Timothy, servants of Christ Jesus, to all the saints in Christ Jesus who are at Philippi, with the overseers and deacons. Some translations say bishops and deacons. But this is the organization that God planned for the church to have overseers, bishops, elders, and then to have deacons who were servants working under them to serve the church. And that church was fully organized. They had elders and deacons. They had the overseers and the deacons and the servants. They were set up the way God wanted it to be. That's a mature church. Something to strive for, to reach that level of completeness and perfection. And then we see that they were never inhospitable. All the way back in Acts chapter 16, when Lydia, the very first convert there that we read about, after she was baptized and her household, she urged us, saying, if you have judged me to be faithful to the Lord, come to my house and stay. And she prevailed upon us. Come stay. Let me take care of you. Let me feed you and make sure everything's good. And then the Philippian jailer himself in 33 and 34 of that chapter. He took them the same hour of the night and washed their wounds. Now, he didn't have to do that. But he did. He was hospitable. And when they went out of the prison after they'd been released, they visited Lydia. They saw the brothers. They encouraged them, and then they departed. They have some time of fellowship and hospitality again before they leave and continue their journey. That's something for us to think about, though. And, you know, the church at Pisgah should strive for that kind of perfection that we read about here, that maturity. I already said, you know, we've got a lot of good things already. It's a good church. But don't stop at being good. Let's strive on to be as complete as we possibly can be, to be as mature as we can be. We need to be doing the same things that the Philippian church was doing to get there. We need to be following that same path. Pressing on, edifying one another, rallying behind missions, being faithful and consistently, being evangelistic, committed to working, trained to maturity individually as well, incredibly benevolent, organized fully is our hope, and never inhospitable. Because when we do all of these things, what we wind up with is perfection. Oh, it doesn't mean there will never be troubles. There were in Philippi. Doesn't mean no one will ever sin again. There were people in Philippi who sinned, just like anybody else, everywhere else. But it means that we'll be a mature church, and we'll be one that will be God's joy and crown. Paul talks about the church in Philippi being his joy and his crown. The church where it was founded, begun with him being imprisoned, beaten and imprisoned. And yet he said, oh, when I think about you, it's with joy. It's not the way we would usually think about a place where we got beaten and thrown in prison. It's not a joyful memory, but for Paul it was, because of what came from it. The joy of a church that grew and matured to be one of the best churches we read about in the New Testament anywhere. If you're here this morning, maybe you haven't been helping the church to grow to maturity. Maybe you yourself haven't grown to maturity and need to grow in some ways. Whatever the case may be, if you have a need to respond to God's invitation today, please do as we stand and sing our invitation song. Pray Christ, your broken heart, so